The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Gatcombe Park as Princess and reviewed the day's schedule with her private secretary. At 73, the Princess Royal maintained the same rigorous work ethic that had defined her entire adult life. Her calendar was packed with engagements, from opening a new children's hospital in Birmingham to attending a Save the Children board meeting in London. Yet despite her busy schedule, and couldn't shake the growing sense of isolation that had been building over the past few years. The transformation had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. When her father passed away in 2021 and had stood beside her brothers during those difficult days, united in grief and duty. She had walked behind the coffin, her face a mask of stoic composure that the British public had come to expect from her. But in the months that followed, as Charles settled into his role as king and Camilla assumed her position as queen consort and began to notice subtle changes in the royal landscape. It started with the guest lists. State dinners that, and had traditionally attended, now seemed to proceed without her. The palace would cite scheduling conflicts or suggest that other members of the family could better represent the crown at certain events. And, ever dutiful, accepted these explanations without complaint. She had never been one to seek the spotlight or demand recognition. Her approach to royal duty had always been straightforward. Show up, do the work, and let others handle the pomp and circumstance. But, as weeks turned to months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Family gatherings at Balmoral were restructured. The annual Christmas celebrations at Sandringham felt different. Where once and had been consulted on family matters and royal protocols, she now found herself receiving information secondhand through official channels or, worse, through media reports. The changes weren't just limited to formal occasions, and noticed that her input on charitable initiatives was sought less frequently. The palace seemed to be streamlining operations, and somehow she had been deemed non-essential to many discussions that affected the monarchy's future direction. Her decades of experience, her reputation as one of the hardest-working royals, her deep knowledge of protocol and tradition, none of it seemed to matter anymore. During a particularly quiet evening at Gatcombe Park, and found herself reflecting on her relationship with Camilla. They had known each other for decades, having moved in similar social circles long before Camilla's relationship with Charles became public knowledge, and had always maintained a polite, if somewhat distant, relationship with her brother's second wife. She understood the complications that Camilla's presence had created for the family, but she had also witnessed firsthand how happy Camilla made Charles. When Charles and Camilla married in 2005 and had supported the union publicly and privately, she believed in the importance of family unity and understood that Charles deserved companionship and love after the tumultuous years following Diana's death, and had even gone out of her way to include Camilla in family traditions, ensuring that the transition into the royal family was as smooth as possible. However, as queen consort, Camilla seemed to be taking a more active role in family dynamics than and had anticipated. Conversations that, and might have had directly with Charles, were now being filtered through Camilla. Decisions about family events and royal duties appeared to be made in consultation with the queen consort, with Anne's input becoming increasingly peripheral. The situation came into sharp focus during the planning of a major royal event celebrating the king's first full year on the throne, and had assumed she would be involved in the planning process, given her extensive experience with such occasions and her position as the Princess Royal. Instead, she learned about most of the arrangements through formal briefings prepared by palace staff. When and attempted to offer suggestions based on her experience, she was politely told that the queen consort had already approved the arrangements. It wasn't that her ideas were rejected outright. Rather, they were simply unnecessary because decisions had already been made without her consultation. The message was subtle but clear. Her voice was no longer considered essential in family or royal matters. The professional slight stung, but the personal implications cut deeper, and had always prided herself on being her brother's trusted confidant. Throughout their childhood and into their adult lives, Charles had relied on Anne's practical wisdom and straightforward advice. She had been one of the few people who could speak honestly to him about difficult situations, offering perspective without agenda or personal ambition. Now, those private conversations seemed to be happening between Charles and Camilla, leaving and on the outside of discussions that shaped not just royal policy, but family dynamics. She began to notice that Charles seemed less available for their traditional walks around Balmoral or their informal chats about family matters. When she did manage to speak with him privately, he often seemed distracted or would mention that he needed to discuss certain topics with Camilla before making any decisions. The shift was particularly painful because and could see that Charles was unaware of how dramatically their relationship had changed. From his perspective, he was simply including his wife in important discussions and decisions, a natural progression for any married couple. He didn't seem to recognize that in doing so, he was inadvertently excluding his sister from conversations and relationships that had been central to their bond for decades. Anne's position became even more precarious when it came to her grandchildren and the younger generation of royals. She had always taken her role as aunt seriously, maintaining close relationships with William and Harry despite the complexities of their parents' divorce and Diana's death. She had been a steady, reliable presence in their lives, someone they could count on for practical advice and emotional support. But as the family structure evolved around Charles and Camilla's marriage, and found herself with less access to family information and fewer opportunities to maintain those relationships. Family gatherings were planned with different dynamics in mind, and Anne's traditional role as the practical aunt who could bridge generational gaps seemed less valued. The isolation wasn't just social, it had professional implications as well, and had always been one of the most active working royals, often undertaking more public engagements than any other family member in a given year. Her approach was efficient and no-nonsense, focusing on substance over style. She preferred small, meaningful interactions to grand ceremonial occasions, and her reputation for punctuality and preparation was legendary among royal staff and the organization she supported. However, as the new reign established its priorities and protocols and found herself being assigned to fewer high-profile engagements, the reasoning was always diplomatic. Other family members might be better suited for certain events, or scheduling conflicts made her participation difficult. But the cumulative effect was a gradual reduction in her visibility and influence within the working royal family. The changes were subtle enough that they might not have been noticeable to outside observers, and continued to maintain a full schedule of public engagements, continued to support her numerous charitable organizations, and continued to represent the crown with the same dignity and professionalism that had characterized her entire career. But within the family structure, she was being systematically marginalized. Perhaps most frustrating was Anne's growing realization that her practical skills and institutional knowledge were being undervalued. She had spent decades learning the intricacies of royal protocol, building relationships with world leaders and diplomatic corps, and developing an understanding of how the monarchy could best serve the British people. This expertise was being set aside in favor of newer approaches and different priorities. The emotional toll of this isolation was something Anne struggled to process. She had never been comfortable with displays of emotion or personal vulnerability, preferring to channel her feelings into work and duty. But the gradual erosion of her place within the family structure challenged her sense of identity and purpose in ways she hadn't anticipated. Late at night, in the privacy of her own home, and would sometimes allow herself to acknowledge the hurt and confusion she felt. She had devoted her entire adult life to serving the crown and supporting her family, often at the expense of personal relationships and private pursuits. The idea that this devotion was no longer valued or needed was almost impossible to process. Yet, even in her growing isolation, it maintained her characteristic stoicism and dedication to duty. She continued to fulfill her royal obligations with the same professionalism that had defined her career. She refused to create drama or seek sympathy, believing that such behavior would be beneath the dignity of her position and harmful to the institution she had served so faithfully. The situation was complicated by Anne's genuine affection for Charles and her respect for the institution of the monarchy. She didn't want to create problems for her brother as he navigated the challenges of his new role as king. She understood the pressures he faced and the difficult balancing act required to modernize the monarchy while maintaining its traditions and relevance. But understanding the larger context didn't make the personal pain any easier to bear, and found herself questioning not just her current role within the family, but the entire trajectory of her life and career. Had all those years of service and sacrifice been preparing her for this gradual slide into irrelevance? Was this simply the natural order of things as the family and institution evolved, or was something more deliberate happening? As autumn approached, and made a decision that would prove to be a turning point in the family dynamics. She would continue to fulfill her duties and maintain her professional commitments, but she would also begin to assert herself in ways that might force Charles to recognize what was happening. The question was whether it was already too late to restore the relationship and trust that had been eroding for months. The Princess Royal had always believed that action spoke louder than words, and she was prepared to take action to address the growing divide between herself and the rest of the royal family. What she couldn't have predicted was how Charles would react when he finally understood the full extent of what had been happening and whether the damage to their relationship could ever be fully repaired. The October morning at Windsor Castle was crisp and clear, with golden leaves scattered across the ancient grounds. Princess Anne arrived for what she believed was a routine meeting about upcoming royal engagements, but she had actually requested this meeting with a specific purpose in mind. After months of careful observation and growing frustration, she had decided it was time to address the situation directly with Charles, and had chosen her words carefully during the days leading up to this meeting. She understood that approaching the king about family dynamics required delicacy, especially when those dynamics involve his wife. But her sense of duty, both to the institution and to their relationship as siblings, demanded that she speak honestly about what was happening. Charles greeted her warmly in his private study, surrounded by the familiar paintings and furniture that had been part of their family's life for decades. He seemed genuinely pleased to see her, which made what and had to say even more difficult. The easy affection between them had always been one of the constants in their lives, and she was about to test that bond in ways that neither of them had anticipated. They began with the usual pleasantries and discussion of upcoming events. Charles shared some concerns about public perception of the monarchy and his hopes for strengthening the institution's relevance in modern Britain, and listened carefully, noting how naturally he spoke about we and us when referring to himself and Camilla, while seeming to unconsciously exclude her from many of the future plans he outlined. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, and took a deep breath and shifted the discussion in a more personal direction. She began by acknowledging how well Charles was handling the challenges of his new role and expressing her continued commitment to supporting the monarchy in whatever way was most helpful. But then she gently raised her concerns about feeling increasingly excluded from family discussions and royal planning. Charles's initial reaction was surprise, followed by what appeared to be genuine confusion. He assured Anne that there had been no intentional exclusion and that her contributions to the family and the monarchy continued to be valued. He seemed to truly believe what he was saying, which made Anne realize just how unconscious the process had been. As Anne provided specific examples of situations where she had been left out of discussions or informed of decisions after they had been made, Charles's expression gradually shifted from confusion to concern. She described the guest list changes, the restructured family gatherings, and the gradual reduction in her consultation on matters where her experience would have been valuable. The conversation became more tense when Anne mentioned her observations about Camilla's growing influence in family decisions. She was careful to express respect for Camilla's position as queen consort, while also pointing out that important family relationships were being affected by the changing dynamics, and emphasized that she wasn't seeking power or recognition for its own sake, but rather hoping to maintain the family bonds and institutional knowledge that had always been part of their shared heritage. Charles's defense of his wife was immediate and passionate. He explained that Camilla was simply fulfilling her duties as queen consort, and that it was natural for him to consult with her on important matters. He suggested that and might be misinterpreting normal marital dynamics as something more problematic. The protective edge in his voice, when speaking about Camilla, made it clear that he viewed any criticism of her role as an attack on their marriage itself. This defensive response led to the most difficult part of their conversation, and found herself in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain how Camilla's well-intentioned involvement in family matters was affecting other relationships within the royal structure. She spoke about feeling like an outsider in her own family, about important conversations happening without her input, and about the sense that decades of shared experience and mutual trust were being diminished. Charles struggled to understand Anne's perspective. From his point of view, he was simply including his wife in decisions and discussions that affected their life together and the monarchy they would lead together. He couldn't see how this natural evolution in his personal relationships was creating problems for other family members. His focus had been on building a strong partnership with Camilla while managing the enormous responsibilities of being king. The emotional undertone of their conversation became more pronounced as Anne tried to help Charles understand not just the practical implications of the changing dynamics, but the personal pain she was experiencing. She had always been his closest confidant among the siblings, the one he could count on for honest advice and unwavering support. The gradual erosion of that special relationship was affecting her in ways that went far beyond professional considerations. Charles began to recognize that something significant was happening, even if he didn't fully understand the scope of the problem. He could see that and was genuinely hurt and frustrated, emotions that she rarely allowed herself to express openly. Her willingness to have this difficult conversation was itself an indication of how seriously the situation had affected her. However, Charles's attempts to address Anne's concerns were complicated by his loyalty to Camilla and his belief that his wife was not intentionally causing problems within the family. He suggested that perhaps they could all work together to improve communication and ensure that everyone felt included in appropriate discussions. But his proposed solutions seemed to miss the fundamental nature of what was happening. The meeting ended without a clear resolution. Charles promised to be more mindful of including Anne in family discussions and to consider her concerns about the changing dynamics, and left feeling somewhat relieved that she had finally voiced her concerns, but also worried that Charles hadn't fully grasped the seriousness of the situation. In the days following their conversation, Anne noticed some small changes in how she was included in certain discussions. Charles made an effort to reach out to her directly about a few family matters, and she was invited to participate in planning for an upcoming royal tour. These gestures suggested that he was trying to address her concerns, but they also felt somewhat forced and artificial compared to the natural collaboration they had shared in the past. Meanwhile, Anne began to notice subtle changes in Camilla's behavior toward her. Where their interactions had previously been cordial but somewhat distant, there now seemed to be an underlying tension. Camilla continued to be polite and appropriate in all their dealings, but Anne sensed a new wariness in their relationship. It was as if Camilla somehow knew that and had raised concerns with Charles, even though the specific content of their conversation hadn't been shared. The situation became more complicated during a family gathering at Balmoral a few weeks later. The traditional Scottish retreat had always been a place where the family could relax and enjoy more informal time together, away from the pressures and protocols of official royal life. But this particular visit felt different too, and charged with undercurrents that made natural conversation difficult. Charles seemed to be making a conscious effort to include Anne in discussions and activities, but his attempts felt stilted and unnatural. The easy flow of conversation and shared decision-making that had characterized their relationship for decades had been replaced by a more formal, careful interaction that satisfied nobody. Anne appreciated her brother's efforts, but found herself mourning the loss of their previous closeness. The tension came to a head during a family dinner when discussion turned to plans for the upcoming year. As various family members shared their thoughts and suggestions and offered some ideas based on her extensive experience with public engagements and charitable work. Her suggestions were met with polite acknowledgement, but then Camilla gently redirected the conversation toward different priorities that she and Charles had already discussed. The interaction itself was entirely appropriate and diplomatic, and could feel the subtle message being conveyed. While Charles was making an effort to include her in conversations, the real decision-making was still happening between him and Camilla. His input was being welcomed as a courtesy, but it wasn't truly influencing the direction of family or royal policy. That evening, it made a decision that would dramatically escalate the family tensions. She requested a private meeting with Camilla, believing that a direct conversation might help them find a way to coexist more effectively within the changing family structure. She hoped that by addressing the situation honestly with the queen consort, they might be able to establish boundaries and expectations that would work for everyone. The meeting with Camilla was scheduled for the following afternoon, and spent the intervening hours carefully considering how to approach this delicate conversation. She wanted to be respectful of Camilla's position while also advocating for her own place within the family structure. The challenge would be finding a way to express her concerns without appearing to challenge Camilla's marriage or her role as queen consort. When the two women sat down together in one of Balmoral's smaller sitting rooms, the atmosphere was cordial but clearly strained. Camilla seemed to understand why and had requested the meeting, and her demeanor suggested that she was prepared for a difficult conversation. Both women were experienced in navigating complex social situations, but this discussion would test their diplomatic skills in ways that neither had anticipated, and began by acknowledging the challenges that Camilla faced in her role as queen consort, and expressing respect for how well she was handling those responsibilities. She then carefully explained her own perspective on the changing family dynamics, and her hope that they could find a way to maintain important relationships while respecting everyone's roles and responsibilities. Camilla's response was measured and diplomatic, but it became clear that she viewed the situation very differently than Anne did. From Camilla's perspective, she was simply fulfilling her duties as Charles's wife and as queen consort. She didn't see herself as actively excluding Anne from anything, but rather as naturally taking her place in discussions and decisions that affected her and Charles's life together. The conversation revealed fundamental differences in how the two women understood family roles and royal responsibilities. Camilla saw her increasing involvement in family matters as a natural evolution of her position, while Anne experienced it as a displacement of relationships and traditions that have been central to her identity and purpose for decades. As their discussion continued, both women maintained their diplomatic composure, but underlying tensions became increasingly apparent. Neither was willing to back down from their position, and neither seemed able to fully understand the other's perspective. The meeting ended with polite expressions of mutual respect, but no real resolution of the underlying issues. The failed conversation with Camilla left, and feeling even more isolated and frustrated than before. She had tried to address the situation through direct communication with both Charles and Camilla, but neither interaction had resulted in meaningful change or understanding. If anything, her efforts to resolve the problems had made the tensions more visible and more difficult to ignore. As autumn turned to winter, the family dynamics continued to deteriorate despite everyone's best intentions. Charles's forced efforts to include and felt increasingly awkward and artificial. Camilla's interactions with and became more careful and guarded, and herself struggled to find her place within a family structure that seemed to be evolving away from the relationships and traditions that had always defined her role. The situation was heading toward a crisis that would test not just the family's personal relationships, but their ability to maintain the unity and stability that the monarchy required to function effectively in the public eye. December brought with it the kind of crisis that the royal family had hoped to avoid during Charles's early reign. What had begun as subtle family tensions was about to explode into a public relations nightmare that would test everyone's commitment to duty above personal feelings. The trouble started with the planning for the Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. For generations, the royal family's Christmas gathering had followed established traditions, with each family member understanding their role in the carefully choreographed holiday activities, and had always been integral to these celebrations, helping to coordinate activities for the younger family members and ensuring that the various charitable obligations associated with the Christmas period were properly managed. However, as the planning progressed and discovered that major decisions about the Christmas celebrations had been made without her input, the guest arrangements had been finalized, the Christmas Day church service details had been settled, and even the traditional Christmas morning gift exchange had been reorganized, all without consulting her. When she inquired about her role in the festivities, she was told that everything had been arranged and that her presence was, of course, expected and welcomed. The message was clear. She was invited as a guest rather than as a participant in the planning process. This distinction might have seemed minor to outside observers, but within the context of royal family traditions, it represented a fundamental shift in Anne's status within the family hierarchy. Anne's frustration reached a breaking point when she learned that several of her long-time charitable commitments during the Christmas period had been reassigned to other family members. Organizations that she had supported for decades, including a children's charity that held special meaning for her, were told that different royals would be representing the family at their Christmas events. When Anne confronted Charles about these changes, she was told that the assignments had been made to better distribute the workload and to give other family members opportunities to expand their charitable portfolios. The reasoning was presented as organizational efficiency, but Anne recognized it for what it really was, a systematic reduction of her role and influence within the working royal structure. The conversation with Charles about the Christmas arrangements was more heated than their previous discussions. Anne's usual diplomatic restraint gave way to genuine anger as she outlined how her lifetime of service was being casually redistributed without consultation or consideration. She pointed out that her relationships with these organizations were built on decades of personal commitment and institutional knowledge that couldn't simply be transferred to other family members on short notice. Charles's response revealed just how out of touch he had become with Anne's perspective. He seemed genuinely surprised by her emotional reaction and suggested that she was being unnecessarily sensitive about what he viewed as routine administrative decisions. His dismissive tone and apparent inability to understand why these changes mattered to her pushed and beyond her usual limits of patience and decorum. For the first time in their adult relationship, Anne raised her voice to her brother. She accused him of allowing Camilla to systematically exclude her from family decisions while he remained obliviously focused on his own marriage and responsibilities. She pointed out that his attempts to include her in conversations after their previous discussion had been superficial gestures that didn't address the fundamental problem of her marginalization within the family structure. Charles's defensive response was swift and sharp. He accused Anne of being jealous of his relationship with Camilla and suggested that her inability to adapt to the changing family dynamics was creating unnecessary drama during what should be a period of stability for the monarchy. He implied that her concerns were driven more by personal ego than by genuine institutional concerns. The argument escalated quickly from there, with both siblings saying things that they would later regret, and accused Charles of being manipulated by his wife and of abandoning the family relationships that had supported him throughout his life. Charles responded by suggesting that Anne's rigid adherence to tradition was preventing her from understanding the modernization that the monarchy needed to survive. Their raised voices attracted the attention of palace staff, who found themselves in the uncomfortable position of witnessing a family argument between the king and the Princess Royal. The breach of royal protocol, represented by this public display of family tensions, would have consequences that extended far beyond their personal relationship. The argument ended with Anne making a declaration that shocked everyone present. She announced that she would not be attending the Christmas celebrations at Sandringham and that she was seriously considering stepping back from her royal duties altogether. The threat was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made it clear she was not making an empty gesture or seeking attention. Charles's immediate reaction was to dismiss Anne's threat as an emotional overreaction that she would reconsider once she had time to cool down. He seemed unable to believe that his practical, duty-focused sister would actually follow through on such a drastic decision. But Anne's expression and tone suggested that she had reached a point where dramatic action felt like the only way to make her voice heard. In the days following their argument, neither sibling reached out to the other. Charles seemed to be waiting for her and to apologize and return to her normal routine, while Anne was waiting for some acknowledgement from Charles that her concerns were valid and that changes needed to be made. The standoff created an uncomfortable tension throughout the royal household that affected everyone from senior courtiers to domestic staff. The situation became even more complicated when news of Anne's threat to skip Christmas began to circulate among other family members. William and Catherine, already dealing with their own challenges as working royals, found themselves in the difficult position of trying to mediate between Charles and without taking sides in a dispute that threatened the family's public unity. Anne's decision to potentially absent herself from Christmas at Sandringham would be impossible to hide from the media and the public. Royal Christmas celebrations were heavily covered by the press, and Anne's absence would inevitably spark speculation about family discord at the worst possible time for Charles's new reign. The practical implications of her threat were forcing everyone to confront just how serious the situation had become. Meanwhile, Anne was dealing with her own emotional turmoil about the possibility of following through on her threat. The idea of missing Christmas with her family went against every instinct she had about duty and loyalty. But her sense of being systematically excluded and undermined had reached a point where traditional solutions seemed inadequate. During this period of family tension, an unexpected development changed the entire dynamic of the situation. A palace staff member, troubled by what they had witnessed, leaked details about the royal family's internal conflicts to a journalist known for their coverage of royal affairs. The leak was careful not to quote anyone directly, but it provided enough detail about the tensions between and the rest of the family to create a major news story. When the story broke in one of Britain's major newspapers, it sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. The headline read, "Princess and Shut Out. Palace sources reveal growing tensions between King Charles and his sister." The article outlined the gradual exclusion of Anne from family decisions, her confrontations with both Charles and Camilla, and her threat to boycott the Christmas celebrations. The public reaction was swift and largely sympathetic to Anne. Her reputation as a hard-working, no-nonsense royal who had dedicated her life to public service meant that many people found it difficult to believe she would create drama without serious cause. Social media was filled with support for the Princess Royal and criticism of what was perceived as poor treatment of one of the monarchy's most reliable members. The negative press coverage put enormous pressure on Charles to address the situation publicly and privately. Palace advisors warned that the story threatened to undermine the image of family unity that was crucial to the monarchy's public standing. The last thing Charles needed during his early reign was a public perception that he was unable to manage relationships within his own family. Charles's first instinct was to issue a standard palace statement denying any serious family discord and emphasizing the royal family's commitment to working together in service of the British people. However, the detailed nature of the leaked information made such denials seem hollow and potentially dishonest. Palace communications staff advised that a more substantive response would be necessary. The crisis deepened when other media outlets picked up the story and began investigating the broader implications of the reported family tensions. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades began connecting current events with patterns they had observed over recent months. Stories emerged about Anne's reduced presence at major royal events and the apparent shift in how royal duties were being allocated among family members. Anne herself remained silent about the media coverage, neither confirming nor denying the reports about family tensions. Her refusal to comment publicly was consistent with her lifelong approach to dealing with press attention, but it also meant that the speculation continued to grow without any authoritative response from her perspective. The situation reached a critical point when palace advisors informed Charles that the negative coverage was beginning to affect public confidence in a monarchy more broadly. Poll numbers showed declining support for the royal family, with many respondents expressing concern about how and was being treated. The crisis had evolved from a private family matter into a genuine threat to the institution's public standing. Faced with this mounting pressure, Charles finally began to understand the full scope of what had been happening and the serious consequences of his failure to address Anne's concerns effectively. The realization that his personal decisions and family management had created a public relations disaster forced him to confront the possibility that he had been wrong about the situation from the beginning. The question now was whether Charles could find a way to repair his relationship with and restore family unity before the damage became irreparable. With Christmas approaching and media attention intensifying, time was running out for a private resolution to what had become a very public crisis. The royal family was about to face one of its most challenging tests in recent memory, and the outcome would have lasting implications for how Charles's reign would be perceived and for Anne's future role within the monarchy. The breaking point had been reached, and now everyone would have to deal with the consequences of months of miscommunication and misunderstanding. The weight of public scrutiny and the potential damage to the monarchy finally broke through Charles's defensive barriers 3 days before Christmas. Sitting in his study at Windsor Castle, surrounded by newspaper clippings and briefing papers about the growing crisis, the king finally began to see the situation from Anne's perspective. The media coverage had laid bare a pattern of exclusion and marginalization that he had been blind to, and the potential consequences for both his reign and his relationship with his sister suddenly became devastatingly clear. The turning point came during a private meeting with his most trusted advisor, Sir Clive Alderton, who had served the royal household for decades and had witnessed the evolution of family dynamics from a unique vantage point. With characteristic directness, Alderton painted a stark picture of how the situation appeared from outside the family bubble that Charles had been operating within. "Your Majesty," Alderton said carefully, "I believe we need to consider the possibility that Her Royal Highness has been treated unfairly, and that this treatment has been more systematic than anyone realized." He went on to outline specific instances where Anne's exclusion from discussions and decisions had been noticed by staff members, instances that Charles had either dismissed or failed to recognize at the time. Alderton's measured analysis forced Charles to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own behavior and the dynamics he had allowed to develop within the family. For the first time, Charles began to understand that his natural inclination to include Camilla in all decisions had created an unintended hierarchy that pushed and further from the center of family life. The advisor also gently pointed out that Anne's decades of loyalty and service gave her concerns more weight than Charles had been willing to acknowledge. Unlike other family members who might raise issues for personal gain or attention, Anne's complaints carried the credibility of someone who had never sought the spotlight and had always put duty above personal interests. As Charles reflected on Alderton's words, memories of recent months began to take on new meaning. He remembered conversations where Anne had seemed unusually quiet or withdrawn, moments when she had offered suggestions that were politely acknowledged but not seriously considered, and instances where she had been informed of decisions rather than consulted about them. What he had interpreted as normal family interactions now appeared as evidence of systematic exclusion. The king also began to recognize how his protective instincts regarding Camilla had influenced his responses to Anne's concerns. Every time Anne had raised issues that seemed to involve Camilla, Charles had automatically moved into defensive mode, viewing any criticism as an attack on his marriage rather than legitimate concerns about family dynamics. This defensive stance had prevented him from truly listening to what Anne was trying to tell him. The media coverage had also highlighted aspects of Anne's character and contributions that Charles had taken for granted. Reading public tributes to his sister's work ethic, her charitable contributions, and her reliability as a working royal, Charles was reminded of just how much and had contributed to the family and the monarchy over the decades. Her reputation as one of the hardest-working members of the royal family wasn't just a media creation. It reflected a genuine commitment to duty that deserved better treatment than she had been receiving. That evening, Charles made a decision that would mark the beginning of his effort to repair the damage that had been done. He called indirectly, not through private secretaries or official channels, and asked if he could come to Gatcombe Park the next morning for a private conversation. The personal nature of his request, and the fact that he was willing to come to her rather than summoning her to him, signaled a significant shift in his approach. Anne's response was cautious, but not hostile. She agreed to the meeting, but made it clear that she expected a substantive conversation rather than another attempt to minimize her concerns or placate her with superficial gestures. Her tone suggested that she was willing to listen, but that any resolution would require genuine acknowledgement of what had happened and concrete changes in how family decisions were made. Charles arrived at Gatcombe Park the next morning with a humility that was unusual for someone in his position. He had spent the previous evening carefully considering not just what he wanted to say, but how to demonstrate through his actions that he understood the gravity of the situation and was committed to making things right. The conversation began with Charles offering a genuine apology for his failure to recognize how and had been affected by the changing family dynamics. He acknowledged that his focus on including Camilla in decisions had unintentionally created a situation where Anne's voice was marginalized, and he took full responsibility for not addressing her concerns more seriously when she first raised them. More importantly, Charles demonstrated that he had thought carefully about specific instances where Anne had been excluded or overlooked. He mentioned particular meetings where her input should have been sought, decisions where her experience would have been valuable, and occasions where she should have been consulted rather than simply informed. This level of detail showed and that he had actually listened to her previous concerns and had taken the time to understand their validity. The king also addressed the more personal aspects of their deteriorating relationship. He acknowledged that his marriage to Camilla, while bringing him personal happiness, had changed family dynamics in ways that he had failed to manage thoughtfully. He expressed regret that Anne had felt pushed aside and assured her that this had never been his intention, while also recognizing that his intentions mattered less than the actual impact of his actions. Anne's response to Charles's apology was measured, but showed signs of the relief she felt at finally being heard and understood. She expressed appreciation for his willingness to acknowledge what had happened, while also emphasizing that words alone wouldn't be sufficient to repair the damage that had been done. She needed to see concrete changes in how family decisions were made and how her role within the royal structure was respected. The siblings spent several hours discussing practical ways to address the problems that had developed. Charles proposed specific changes to how family meetings would be structured, ensuring that Anne would be consulted on decisions that affected royal duties and family traditions. He also suggested regular one-on-one meetings between them, separate from discussions that involved Camilla, to maintain the direct communication channel that had been so important to their relationship throughout their lives. Perhaps most significantly, Charles addressed the issue of Anne's charitable commitments and royal duties. He promised to restore her involvement in the organizations where her participation had been transferred to other family members, and he committed to consulting her before making future decisions about royal duty assignments. This wasn't just about returning to the previous status quo. It was about creating a more thoughtful and inclusive approach to family coordination going forward. The conversation also touched on the difficult topic of Camilla's role in the family dynamics. Charles acknowledged that his wife's natural involvement in discussions had sometimes displaced other family relationships, and he committed to being more mindful of maintaining appropriate boundaries. This was a delicate issue that required balancing his loyalty to his wife with his obligations to other family members, but Charles seemed to understand that this balance was necessary for family harmony, and it expressed some skepticism about whether the proposed changes would actually be implemented consistently, given the established patterns of behavior that had developed. She had been disappointed before by promises of inclusion that weren't followed through, and she wanted assurance that this conversation represented a genuine turning point rather than another temporary adjustment. To address these concerns, Charles proposed creating more formal structures for family consultation and decision-making. Rather than relying on informal conversations and assumptions about who should be involved in various discussions, he suggested establishing clearer protocols that would ensure appropriate family members were consulted on decisions that affected them. This systematic approach would make it more difficult for exclusionary patterns to develop unconsciously. The emotional undertone of their conversation gradually shifted from tension and hurt to something approaching their previous closeness. As they talked through the problems and potential solutions, both siblings began to remember why their relationship had been so important to them throughout their lives. Anne's practical wisdom and Charles's genuine desire to do right by his family created the foundation for rebuilding trust between them. However, both siblings understood that repairing their relationship would take time and consistent effort. The patterns of exclusion and misunderstanding that had developed over months couldn't be resolved with a single conversation, no matter how heartfelt. They would need to work actively to rebuild the trust and communication that had been damaged. Charles also had to address the public relations aspect of the crisis. The media coverage had created expectations for visible signs of family reconciliation, and the Christmas celebrations at Sandringham would be closely watched for evidence of whether the reported tensions had been resolved. Anne's participation in the festivities would be seen as a crucial indicator of whether the family had overcome their differences. To demonstrate his commitment to change, Charles made an unprecedented gesture. He asked Anne to take a leading role in coordinating the Christmas celebrations, essentially reversing the exclusion that had sparked the original crisis. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a practical recognition of Anne's organizational skills and her importance to family traditions. Anne accepted this responsibility with some wariness, understanding that she would be closely watched by both family members and the media. But she also recognized it as an opportunity to reestablish her role within the family structure and to demonstrate that the changes Charles had promised were being implemented in practice. The public announcement of Anne's enhanced role in the Christmas celebrations sent a clear message that the family tensions had been addressed. Palace statements emphasized the king's appreciation for his sister's contributions to the royal family and his commitment to ensuring that all family members felt valued and included in important decisions. The Christmas celebrations at Sandringham became a test of whether the private reconciliation between Charles and could translate into genuine changes in family dynamics. Anne's visible involvement in coordinating activities and her apparent comfort during public appearances suggested that significant progress had been made in repairing their relationship. More importantly, the Christmas gathering established new patterns for family interaction that addressed many of the issues that had caused problems in the first place. Family meetings included broader consultation, decision-making processes were more transparent, and there was a conscious effort to maintain the relationships and traditions that had always been important to family unity. The media coverage of the Christmas celebrations was largely positive, focusing on the apparent resolution of family tensions and the strong working relationship between Charles and Anne. While some commentators remained skeptical about whether the changes would be lasting, the immediate evidence suggested that both siblings were committed to making their reconciliation work. In the months that followed, Charles continued to demonstrate his commitment to the changes he had promised and was consistently included in family discussions. Her charitable commitments were respected and expanded, and the direct communication between the siblings was restored to something approaching their previous closeness. While their relationship would never be exactly what it had been before, it evolved into something that honored both the lessons learned from their crisis and their shared commitment to serving the monarchy and the British people. The experience had taught both Charles and invaluable lessons about the importance of communication, the dangers of taking family relationships for granted, and the need for conscious effort to maintain the bonds that supported both their personal happiness and their public duties. Most importantly, It demonstrated that even serious family conflicts could be resolved when people were willing to listen, acknowledge their mistakes, and commit to doing better in the future.